video, we're going to be going over the switch object using WatchOS here. So WK interface switch. And we're going to be learning how to style it, how to get it to do various things for us, and how we can implement that in an app. So first of all, as you can see, I'm just on my blank storyboard. So if I bring up my file navigator, you can see I'm on my interface.storyboard for my WatchKit app with nothing on it. So it's just blank right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide this panel away. I'm going to bring in my objects library here. You can see I have switch already selected here in the lower right. So my objects library, if you're not familiar with it, this is of course where you can choose from a pretty big library of objects to bring into your app. Now WatchOS, if you're coming from say iOS, you're going to notice that this is a lot smaller than you may be used to. And that's because with such a small screen size, it kind of limits us in terms of what we can do. But you know what? That just means we have to make efficient use of our space here. So I'm going to bring in my switch here. And just as a tip, if you click on it and wait a second, it's going to pop out this little hoverable. And as it says here, switch is a control for indicating a binary value. Switches have an on and off state that the user will be able to toggle. And then we can kind of give it some behavior later on once you kind of adjust the appearance. So first of all, I'm just going to bring over our switch, and I just clicked and dragged it over. And from here, you can see that there's some options you can adjust here in our attributes inspector. So our attributes inspector looks like kind of like an arrow on a line, and so that's the one we want to go to adjust the appearance here. So as you can see, it kind of defaults to certain values. It defaults to being on, and you can switch that around using state up here, right? So these UI adjustments are pretty easy to do. And it's actually quite customizable. So you can change the color, for example, in the tint, and you can use a color wheel. You know, all these options you're used to, they're all available here, of course, as well. Let's see here. You know what, let's just go with, this bright green color. Pretty close to what it was already. And here you can see, you can kind of tell whether it's enabled or not. Right, so that's an enabled on and off switch on the switch, basically. Title, obviously you can update the title. So let's call this my switch. Okay, and you can see that it updates. And you can imagine how this would be pretty useful. Lines defaults to 0. You can increase the lines if you need more lines for your switch. For example, if I were to say paste in a title that was more than one line, for example, I am 2 lines. Because it's set to 0, it's just going to expand as long as it needs. If I set it to 1, it's going to start to cut it off. Pretty rare that you would see a switch with multiple lines, but it could happen. So let's put this back to my switch. So yeah, if you need more lines, that's the way you would do it. Color, so here you can adjust the color of the text as well. So you can see my switch is changing colors. Let's see, let's go with this bright pink. That's pretty neat looking. Font, of course, you can change as well. So font, there's a couple of preset options here. For example, if you want it to look like a footnote or a subheader. If you wanted, say, bold, you just have to look in these system fonts and then style here. So for example, ultra light versus bold, for example. So that's how you would do that. And you know, let's see what semi-bold looks like. Yeah, that's pretty good for our switch, I think. And then of course you can adjust the size as well. Right, so if you want a huge switch, that's something you can do, keeping in mind that it might kind of warp your text, as you can see that it's doing over here. Right, so just kind of fun to tinker around with this, get it to look how you want it to look. Let's set it to size 20 so it's kind of easier to see. And here you'll notice the min scale attribute. So this, if you've never seen it before, will basically scale your text if you need to, say, shrink the container, for example, or adjust the size of the font. So for example, 1, it's actually the highest it goes, so 1 is just normal size. But then let's say we put in 0.5, so in theory this would shrink our text up to 0.5 of its original size, so 50%, if we need to shrink it down to fit a container. So let's just leave that at 0.5. You could also put it to 0, in which case it would kind of default to 0.8. If you just leave it at 0. Other attributes we can adjust are alpha. So the alpha basically adjusts the opaqueness. As you can see, it just kind of makes it more transparent as we go down the alpha scale here. But you know what, I'm just going to leave it at 1. And other attributes we have here, not going to worry too much about semantic at this point, but alignment we can adjust as well. So if we wanted to put it in the center, well, it's already taking up the entire width. It's not going to do anything. But vertical, we could definitely move it around. So center, we can put it in the center of the screen. And then here we can adjust the size. So if we make it smaller, for example, it doesn't really look that good, but you can definitely adjust it however you see fit. You can also say size to fit content instead. These switches, they tend, in my opinion, on a WatchOS anyway, they probably should take up the entire width, because you don't want to have a tiny little switch that's going to be really hard to get to in your app. I wouldn't want that anyway. But in any case, you can kind of adjust these however you see fit. So you can see if I adjust the height to relative its container, the container is just the entire interface here. But you can definitely shrink it down like so, for example. So I'm just going to kind of reset this to how it was. All right, and I'm not really happy with the fact that it's taking up 2 lines. So let's go in and let's adjust our font. Fix that. There we go. Okay. Yeah, a bit bigger. Yeah, there we go. That looks okay. All right. So as far as UI stuff goes, that's the basics in terms of the attributes we can adjust. Now let's take a look at adjusting these programmatically instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab another switch object here, bring it in, and this switch I'm going to adjust the settings programmatically instead of using our attributes inspector. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up our assistant editor, and I can do that by grabbing these 2 kind of rings, and that's going to bring up our code over here on the right. And I like to keep my interface storyboard on the left so I can keep an eye on that as well. And in case you're wondering, I am zoomed in here 200% from the original size, so that's why it's kind of big over there. So as you can see, this is just kind of our standard interface controller. That is type WatchKit interface controller, and with some basic functions. Right now it's not really doing anything, but these functions are built in, and we can add some behavior if we want. For example, to func awake, func will activate, func did deactivate. Not going to focus too much on those at this point though. First thing I will do though is I'm going to grab my switch that I just created. I'm going to hold down Control and click and drag it over to create an outlet. Okay, so this is an outlet, and you can see that it could be an action as well in this case, but I'm going to just make it an outlet, and I'm going to call it outlet my switch. And as you can see, you can adjust the type here, but there's only one option, WK interface switch. And storage, make sure it's set to weak, and we will hit connect, and you'll see it creates a variable with our interface builder here. So IB outlet variable outlet my switch is of type WK interface switch. Now we have a variable and it's connected. By the way, if you hover over this little circle, it shows you what it's connected to over on our storyboard, which is pretty convenient if you have a lot of these at once. But now I can kind of manipulate this variable and change some settings. So let's go ahead and do that. Now there's a bunch of methods we can just call directly on the outlet. Because it's WK interface switch, these are available to us. So what we can do is we can configure them here in our in our function awake, and this is where Apple recommends you do some initializing here, and you can see it here in the built-in comment as well, configure interface objects here. So if I just grab the variable outlet my switch and just tabbing through to autocomplete, and you can see that it gives us a whole bunch of options here initially. So autocomplete is pretty useful in terms of showing you the methods that are available already. But if we wanted to say set title, we could easily do that, and it just takes a string. So for example, we could say switch number 2. And this should work, and I'm going to run the simulator, and you can do that by hitting Command R, or you can hit this little play button up here, and you just want to make sure that it's set to show your watch as well. Apparently my storage full on my simulator, but we'll just wait for this to reload. So we compiled the code, okay, this will load, there it goes. And yeah, so we can see we set the text programmatically. So you can imagine how this could be useful, right? So if you want to update what your switch shows for whatever reason, it's very simple to do that easily. And if you have experience using labels or timers, it's pretty much the same as changing the text on a label. By that logic, it's pretty simple to also change things like the color. So let's do that here. So we can just kind of put it down below here. My switch dot set color, right? And it takes a UI color. So that means we can say UI color dot, and then we can kind of choose any color we need for the most part. So let's go with blue. Why not? Okay, and this will basically affect the color when it's on a switched status. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's launch our simulator again, and let's just kind of take a look at it, what it looks like now. Okay, so wait for that to load. Shouldn't take too long because it doesn't have that much to do, but sometimes it takes longer than others. All right, there it goes, and you can see that it kind of defaults to blue. And you know, switches, they do have default behavior as well. So when you switch it off, it removes the color there. But that's how you adjust the color. Another neat trick is you can just put in a color literal. So instead of UI color, if I just start typing in color, it gives me the option here for UI color literal. If I tab here, it brings up this color literal that I can just put in. And it's kind of nice to be able to do this so that you can see what it's going to look like. So if I just select this one, and so now it should show up as this shade instead. I'm not going to run the simulator because we know what this will look like, but it's kind of nice to be able to do that as well. Another handy thing is we can set it to be on or off when it initially loads. And we can do that pretty simple. Set on, and you can see that it takes a Boolean. So if we say false, let's see what it looks like. Okay, we'll launch it in the simulator. And I expect you probably know what it's going to look like, but it's always kind of nice to test it out and make sure it's working. Okay, here it goes. Any minute now. All right, so you can see it defaulted to be off when we loaded it. Right, now we can switch it on with our cool light blue color there. And again, you see how this would be useful. So for example, if you load something up and once something loads, you decide to switch it to on or off, you could easily do that. It kind of defaults to on, so this explicit set on to true is usually not necessary, but you can definitely do it programmatically. So if at some point it was switched off and you later decide, you know, if there's a button someone can press elsewhere to switch it on, that's how you would do that. So I'm going to get rid of this. We're going to default it to being on, but we can also set it to be enabled or not. So just to remind you of what that looks like, if we bring this thing over and select this switch, so now it's enabled, now it's not enabled. So it kind of grays it out. And so we can do that programmatically as well, of course. Get rid of this console. So we can do that like so. Outlet my switch, just grab the variable dot set enabled. Whoops, set enabled is what I wanted. You can see that this takes a Boolean as well. And by default, it is enabled, but if we say false, now we can alter the color of the actual text as well, but it's a little bit more difficult. So first of all, let's just try this out, set enabled to false, and we'll see if we can tell what it looks like here. So I'm going to hit Command R to rerun our simulator. And essentially it should be kind of grayed out a little bit because it won't be enabled. So let's just see though what it looks like. Okay, and is there anything wrong with doing it the way we initially did it? Absolutely not. So if you're more comfortable using the attribute inspector, by all means. But here it's kind of hard to tell, but you can see it's not quite the same shade. Over here it's kind of white, and here it's grayed out. So we set it to be disabled, and you can see I can't actually switch it right now. So this might be useful as well if you want to use this as kind of a way to convey to your users that a switch is disabled. And of course, it's easier when your switch, the text is colored, but you know, this way it's clear to the user that, okay, I can't edit this switch for some reason, and you can also imagine how this would be useful in a more detailed app as well. Next, let's get rid of that because I don't want it to be disabled, but I do want to say, for example, change the color of the text. So how would we do that? We can use an attributed string for that. And what's an attributed string? Well, it's basically a string with information along with it. So right now when we say set title, it just takes a simple string and it sets it to the title. But if we want to do something like color, we need to use an attributed string for that. So I'm going to configure a couple of variables here, and they're going to be basically used to set our title. So we'll say let title string equal, we'll say ns foreground color attribute name. Okay, and here we give it a name. So UI color dot, let's see, what color should we make this one? Let's make it green so it really stands out. Okay, and this one is just taking a single parameter, so ns foreground color attribute name. Oh, that's the color. Okay, so we'll say title color instead. Title color, and we'll put the string into its own variable here, constant rather. So we will say let, this shouldn't be title, this should be switch. Let's switch title equal ns attributed string. Yep, that's what I want. And we'll say string is switch number 2. And because it's a attributed string, we can say attributes. And for attributes, we're going to take switch color, which means we probably have to move this down below so it understands what we want. Okay. And it's not happy about these being here, I think, because we don't initialize them properly. So I'm going to move these. So cut. Okay, make some extra space. And I'll just put it here where I configure my other interface objects. So on awake, it's going to set these. And then here, when we, instead of saying set title, we just instead need to say set attributed title. You can see in here it takes an ns attributed string, which we created up above. So the title switch title. Okay, and so now this should work. Let's test it out. We'll run our simulator here. And fingers crossed this works as expected. Okay, and if you're not used to NS attributed strings, this might seem strange to you, but as I said, it's just a way of passing in info along with strings. And you know what? I can see that it worked. So we're setting the text, we're setting the color here, and we can actually kind of switch it back and forth. So is it a little bit more work than using our attributes inspector? Yeah, sure, but it's really good to know how to do this programmatically because, like I've been saying, you may want to kind of alter the appearance or behavior of your objects programmatically. And it's just kind of good to know, to understand what it's doing for us behind the scenes as well. It really makes us appreciate if we do decide to use our attributes inspector as well. Next, we can also improve our code a little bit so that we can make our switch color and switch title more modular and we can kind of reuse it easier. So the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to declare them as variables up above here. So switch color, and I'm going to give it a type so that we can explicitly tell it what to expect. And this will be basically a dictionary here, and it's going to take a string, which is referring to the NS foreground color attribute name, and the other parameter will be a UI color, and I will put a question mark so that it designates it as optional. Next, we will do the same here for switch title. This is an NS attributed string, the question mark there. And then here we just remove let, and this is initializing the variables, and this is declaring them as soon as the func awake is called. Now, how can we kind of switch between different styles? Well, that's going to take us to the next section here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some behavior here to the switch down below. And basically when the switch is off, well, we'll change the style of the switch above it. So let's call this one upper switcher, for example. And you know what, it takes 2 lines, that's fine. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to group these together. Mark, let's see, outlets and vars. And the reason I put mark there is so that I can navigate back to that easily. So this is kind of a special word when you put it in comments like that, because up here, this section here, you can actually go to all your different functions and methods. And now you can see I have outlets and vars, which is what I marked as mark here. So this is useful if you have, lots and lots of lines of code. I'm going to group these together. And down below that, I'm going to control click this upper switcher, drag it over. And this one, instead of an outlet, I'm actually going to make it an action, so that when this one is triggered, it's going to do something. So let's call it action upper switcher. Okay, so you see the IB, so the interface builder now designates as an action, and it has a function, and it takes in a value bool. So let's kind of see what it's showing us the value to be. So we can do that by printing to the console here. So let's print the value initially, and let's just see what it shows us. So I'm going to run this in my simulator. And we're going to want to keep an eye down below on the console, because we're going to be printing something to the console. And yep, so there it goes. Okay, here we go. So let's see what happens. If I switch this, false, now it's true, now it's false. Okay, so we can actually kind of play around with this. And we can say, for example, if value is equal to true, then we can do something. So if the value is equal to true, let's switch the colors of the upper switch. And we can actually just kind of grab it by the variable name, so outlet my switch. And just to test it out initially, let's just set the title using a normal string. I've been switched. Okay, now let's try this and let's just see what happens. And as usual, we're going to be building it out incrementally and learning about switches in the process. Okay, so you can see even though I'm not affecting the upper switch by clicking on it, we can also just grab the variable and set the title on it when we run this function. So let's see what happens. Okay, so we switched it off, we switched it on again, and now it's switched to I've been switched. Okay, so that's kind of neat. And then we can just kind of revert it if we say if value equals false, what are we going to do? Well, let's try it out here. So if value, actually we can just probably say else. Else. So we can actually just call self.awake. And notice when we say awake, this is where we set our initial values. So with context, self should work. So referring to our interface controller itself. And let's try it out. Let's see what it does. Okay, so we'll load it up here. Build succeeded. Good. Okay, there it goes. So keep an eye on our upper switch. We'll play with our upper switcher here. So switch it off and then on. Okay, I've been switched. We switch it back. It goes back. And then we can see we can switch back and forth. Right, so in this context, we're just referring to our self.awake. But in reality, you're probably going to have a couple different ways that you're going to want to switch this instead of referring to self.awake. But this just shows how we can switch back and forth using switch, and it's pretty easy with a simple if-else statement. Another way we could do our switch is just to kind of declare a variable, and when the switch is triggered, it just switches the variable from true to false. So for example, var switched, we'll say it's a bool, and we'll initialize it to false. Okay, so var bool initializes to false, and then whenever this is hit, we will just switch it from false to true. So for example, switched is equal to the opposite of switched. Okay. Then we can say if switched is equal to true. And in fact, a shorthand to do that is we can just say if switched. So if this is equal to true, then we are going to do something. So, let's declare a couple variables here. So we'll say switch color is, and as foreground color attribute name, and let's say UI color dot, what do you think? Red? Yeah, let's go with red. Okay, we'll do switch title equals, and as attributed string, I've been switched. Okay, attributes will of course be our switch color. Switch color. Okay, and then we just set it like so. Outlet my switch dot set attributed string, attributed title, right? Attributed title is switch title. Okay, and let's set the color like we did down here as well. Outlet my switch dot set color, and this one will be the color of the actual switch. So where it's green over here, let's give it a color literal, because why not? So color, let's see here. There we go. Let's see, what should we go with here? Well, our text is going to be red. So what goes good with red? Well, let's just do, I don't know, orange. All right. And then we can say else self.awake with context of self. Okay. So just a different way of doing it, but let's test it out here. So we'll stop what we're doing and we will run our simulator again and we'll see if we broke anything. Right? It's a lot of it is seeing what we broke or if we broke anything. Okay, and in my opinion, this way it's a bit clearer in terms of our intention on what we are trying to communicate. So if someone else is coming along to read our code, it's a bit clearer what we're doing here, because we just say, okay, switched is one variable or another. So let's try it. False, I've been switched. Okay, so now we can switch back and forth, and that's pretty convenient. Right, so it definitely works, and it's just another way of doing it.